Accessory by Sir Politic MB, aka FimFlamFilosophy. Forward. The following fic may require some explanation, so read here before proceeding. The essential detail to know is that My Little Pony has generated a surprising amount of romance writing. People love to combine the characters, riding with them on their ups and downs, but often the approach is somewhat clumsy. The characters will have loved each other all along. They don't daydream about other prospective candidates. They don't explore their options. Rather, they are merely compelled to seek out one partner, and they confess their feelings in one sticky, gooey, emotional climax. Seeing this done time and time again, I began to wonder about it. Clearly there's something there about the characters that makes them attractive, or else the show wouldn't have generated so many young male fans. But what? And why? Further, there must be a way to explore these qualities without simply diving headfirst into the shallow end of romance. That's called pornography in most circles. So this fic began. Its intent is to do exactly what the show does. Explore relationships and their meaning, from the cherished highs to the repugnant lows. However, to do this the characters need to be human. We communicate too much with our eyes, hands, posture, and otherwise to go without human form, when our tale requires close attention to courtship rituals. With human bodies, then, I chose human names. Although Rarity might be a cute name for a pony, for a human girl it's a stage name, not something I might name my daughter. Along with these two evils, I must name yet a third, an original character. For a good romance, from conception to consummation, we require someone fresh, someone we don't know, so that we can develop our own first impressions, then try madly to ascertain what we are to the other person. Where does the dominance lay? Who is chased and who is pursued? And if there is no chase, then why? Rest assured that the My Little Pony universe is there. However, much it has matured. Dash still flies, but human beings need to find ways to pay for their planes. Applejack runs her farm, but work is never done for a small family. Rarity runs her boutique, Spike still fawns over her, Twilight still writes about relationships. It's all there, simply in a different form, researched such that, if Ponyville and all its inhabitants could exist in the real world, this is how it would be done. So if you read this far, and trust me, by all means take my hand and we'll proceed from here. If not, then such is life, and rejection is sadly part of the human experience. If you feel you must absolutely know which characters are which in order to enjoy the story, then the following guide will help you along. Abigail is Applebloom. Anne Jane, usually shortened AJ, is Applejack. Faith is Fluttershy. Granny Smith is Granny Smith. Maxwell, usually just called Mac, is Big Macintosh. Pepper is Pinkie Pie. Rochelle, which is conveniently means Little Rock, is Rarity. Ray is Rainbow Dash. Sarah is Scootaloo. Spencer is Spike. Suzanne is Sweetie Belle. And Tabitha is Twilight Sparkle. And so, we begin Accessory. Faith hated parties. She hated noise. She hated bright lights. She hated mingling with strangers. And worst of all, she hated the idea of someone might notice that she hated it. It was a small town, though, so that meant every time there was a party, she had to go. And every time she went, she did the same thing. It was exactly what she was doing now. She waited in the corner like a wallflower, a mildly alcoholic drink in one hand, her hair clutched nervously in the other. A man brushed past her, politely placing a hand on her shoulder as he did so. Faith apologized for being in the way. She'd lived here for several years and still didn't properly recognize half the faces in the room, but most people had gotten used to her as a kind of living, breathing obstacle. It wasn't that she didn't try, it was just that not everyone wanted to talk to her. Between all the colorful lights, the noise, the snacks, and the liquor, there were more interesting things to do. Faith made eye contact with someone as they passed by her. It was a young boy from the grocer, who Faith was several years older than. He spotted Faith standing there, but it looked like he had some other thought in mind. and he was looking beyond her. She quickly averted her eyes, taking a sip from her wine cooler, pretending she'd only caught his glance by accident. He nodded as he passed her, then vanished into the crowd. Faith exhaled. She hated parties so much. She never had any fun. She glanced furtively around, looking for one of her few close friends, hoping nobody would notice. The point was to meet new people, and she felt wrong for trying to avoid it. With little effort, she picked her friend Pepper out of the crowd. She was the one with the bouncy red hair, the one who was surrounded by other people, the one who was essentially the life of the party. She was talking to, well, everyone, more or less. Pepper was a popular lady, and although they were close, she and Faith often clashed, frequently without Pepper even realizing it. Faith held dozens of secret grudges against the girl, but was friends with her all the same, because Pepper was the only one who forced Faith out of the house every now and then. Even now, Pepper was giggling and laughing, probably under the assumption that Faith was enjoying herself somewhere. Pepper put her hand on the chest of a man, looking at him while she chortled as some joke she told, no doubt to herself. Faith didn't recognize the man, though. He wasn't just a face without a name, but somebody she'd never seen before. He was wearing a nice shirt, freshly pressed. His hair was neatly combed, and he was carrying some kind of dark cocktail. He was a little on the cute side. Someone poked Pepper in the back. She shrieked in mock terror, then turned around to face the aggressor, only to embrace the person in a chuckling, screaming hug. Then, guided by that ancestral force, some prickling hairs on the neck that tells when someone is being watched, the cute man turned his head and looked at Faith. It wasn't just a casual glance. Faith was a turtle just realizing the shadow overhead was the kind of hawk that sweeps turtles up and drops them on rocks. Or, in short, utterly defenseless, and also a little green, but that may have been the wine cooler. The look was direct, piercing, like he'd been trying to catch her attention all night, and now that their eyes met he didn't look away. Faith's heart raced. She had no idea what to do next. She remembered vaguely something about visiting a zoo and there being a warning not to look directly into the eyes of the gorillas. Blink, her mind urged desperately. She did, then looked at her feet. Now that she was being watched, she sought for something to keep herself occupied. Faith went to sip from her wine cooler. It was empty. Faith pretended to sip from it anyway, but only stumbled through the pantomime half-heartedly. Still in panic, she flicked her eyes to see if the man was looking. He wasn't. Pepper had pulled his attention away again. She was assaulting him with some story now, one that required a lot of wild gesticulation. The man was smiling and nodding along politely. He seemed to be intently focused on whatever Pepper was saying, but wasn't getting a much in edgewise. Faith wanted to see if he'd look back at her again, but he didn't. Faith's heart settled, or maybe even sank. She wasn't sure which. A moment ago she'd wanted to flee like a wild hare, but now she was slowly dialing back into wallflower mode. With a sense of impending doom past, she didn't know which feeling she actually preferred, but she decided moving around was better than standing uncertainly in one place. Faith spent the rest of the party in a modest haze. She was feeling a little tipsy, but also so because her mind was glued to what had just happened. Had the guy noticed her before? Across the room without Faith realizing? He wouldn't look at a girl for the first time that way, would he? Faith milled about, listening in on conversations, then wandering off with her mind whenever it took her. Every now and then she glanced over her shoulder to look for that man, if only to see if he was looking at her again. Once or twice she spotted him, but he seemed intent on other things, other people. Usually he was just listening to someone or injecting minor commentary here and there, nothing unusual. Maybe Faith had just imagined the glint in his eye. He'd startled her, so she'd seen a snake in the shadows when all she tripped over was a garden hose. If she had a dime for every time that had happened, she'd have at least 20 cents this week alone. The party began to die down in the early morning, and people started to go home. Faith was seated outside on the balcony. Usually she left any social event as soon as someone else did, making some excuse about bedtimes, but tonight she wasn't in the mood to go straight to bed all alone. By now she was mulling over the idea of meeting someone at a party. Having a look like that turn into something. She pictured how things would go if she had a little more confidence. But the ideas were sad fantasies. And as Faith sat there, dreamily plotting her fictional romance ascension, her imagination strode out onto the balcony in full color and high definition. The man with the look gave Faith a cursory glance, then sat across from her with a mild grunt, his dark cocktail still in hand. The wind carried a faint fragrance over to Faith's side of the balcony. All her carefully laid fantasy plans flew from her brain like a flock of clumsy pigeons. Faith tried not to look at him directly, then pleaded with herself not to act nervous. The latter was meeting a great deal of internal resistance, and the more she fought the urge to be stiff and awkward, the worse it felt. Was her hair okay? Did her shirt have any stains? She checked the man, who was quite calmly stargazing. He hadn't seemed to notice she was freaking out in the slightest. Their eyes met again. Twice, actually, because Faith looked away at first, but this time he seemed calm, relaxed. After a brief pause, he went back to stargazing, gently tapping his foot on the wood floorboards. Faith eventually followed his gaze upwards. The pulse of the music was still emanating from inside. It was a nice night. Gradually, but surely, all those little pigeons came back to roost. Regaining the thread of her imagination, Faith started thinking of how she'd like this to go. Maybe he'd ask her to dance, and she'd say yes. Except Faith didn't really know how to dance, and she probably would be way too nervous. He looked her way again, noticing her staring. Faith smiled, and the man smiled warmly back at her. Then he cast his eyes to the stars again, tapping his foot, sipping from his drink. He seemed nice. Faith felt a little glow when he smiled at her, and that smile was still there on his face as he gazed out into the distance. Faith kept smiling too. She didn't know what to do next. Why wouldn't he talk to her? Was he shy? Maybe he'd come out here to talk to her, but once he got here he got nervous and didn't know what to say. That meant they were both just sitting out here across from each other like flustered birds. The wind kicked up, bringing another fresh sample of the light scent he was wearing. My name is Faith, Faith decided, quietly, out loud. She'd nearly rubbed brain cells together for that one. The man waited a few seconds, still smiling lightly, probably to see if Faith had anything else to add. She didn't. "That's very pretty," he complimented. Faith blushed. She clutched at her hair and looked away from him. Oh God, he was going to think she had brain problems. "Thank you," she managed, her voice wavering. The man smiled a little wider, then went back to examining the night sky. Faith regained her composure after him. She tried to think of some way that she could break the ice a little better. Start a conversation. She wasn't used to being on the aggressive side of things. She wasn't even much used to the passive side of things. It was harder than she thought. "I'm one of Pepper's friends," Faith offered, remembering that she'd seen him with the other girl earlier. The man nodded. He drew his attention to her, as if this were the beginning of a captivating conversation topic. "An old friend, really. I met her right after her grandma died," Faith explained. "Really?" the man replied. "I hadn't heard about that." "Yeah, she was really old," Faith finished. "Her grandmother, not Pepper." She backpedaled, forcefully willing herself not to titter. She wasn't tittering at the dead grandmother. Faith was sniggering at her depressingly terrible exposition. Or maybe because of how nervous she felt, or because she had a little too much to drink. She had started with an intro, carried into a body, then ended in a conclusion, all of which culminated into somebody's dead grandma. It was the world's shortest story with the least amount of information. Not exactly an award winner. This was awful. The man rolled his head back and chuckled softly. "Oh yeah," he agreed reverently. "That one's a killer." Faith grinned, which was easy enough since her body was already trying to force it. "Nobody ever seems to get better from old," she added, catching speed that he'd mistaken her bumbling for cleverness, however dark. They both exchanged small laughs. The man sighed and checked his watch. "It's getting late," he resigned. Faith frowned. She hadn't even gotten the man's name yet. She didn't know if she'd see him around town at all, but she'd just made progress. Really terrible progress involving Pepper's dead grandmother, but still progress. She wasn't ready to see him go yet. At least not on that note. "Well, not honestly," the man continued, glancing through the doors into the house. "But I've had enough lights and noise for one evening." Faith nodded emphatically. She knew exactly what he meant. "The only problem is I seem to have lost track of my hostess, and I have no idea how to get back to where I'm staying," he confessed. That sounded suspiciously like a line. The thought of inviting the man back to her home for the evening flashed briefly across Faith's mind, but she squashed that thought immediately. It was much too forward. There was no way. Faith wasn't out for a one-night stand anyway. "Oh? Where are you staying?" she asked instead. "At a lovely little apple orchard on the outskirts of town," the man explained. "Is that Sweet Apple Acres?" Faith inquired, knowing full well there must not be another orchard for miles. "That's the place," the man agreed. "Another one of my close friends owns that farm." Faith provided, a little pleased with the coincidence. The pigeons that ran the creative part of Faith's mind, and indeed a few other branches and divisions, began signaling to each other, drawing lines between the dots of chance and the arrangement of constellations. "That sweet old woman?" the man asked. "AJ isn't that old," Faith replied, smiling sardonically, having slighted her young friend. The man drew a wide, smirking grin. He leaned forward. "Well, and here I took you for one of the quiet ones," he accosted. He rose from his seat, motioning for the girl to join him. She did, and he took her by the arm before proceeding to walk out of the house with her. For the first time ever, Faith was actually leaving the party with a guy on her arm. Okay, she was basically just giving directions, but it was like a moment of triumph, one which was predominantly spent staring at her feet. "So what do you do around here, Faith?" the man asked his new companion as they left the doorstep. He pointed in the direction he presumed was the farm, which Faith corrected. "I'm a vet," she liberally expounded. "Seems like a small town for veterinary work," the man observed. Faith shook her head. "A lot of people keep pets around here, and the farms always keep steady business," she explained. "Don't tell me you castrate the bulls," the man asked, feigning shock. Faith nodded, smiling. She didn't look at him. He was teasing. "Goodness," the man commented severely. It was something about the way he said it that suddenly made Faith feel supremely embarrassed she told him that. She felt the hotness creeping into her face like a volcanic geyser. She clasped her hands over her in shame, hiding, plodding blindly along aside the man as he led. She could feel him looking at her like this, and the heat only radiated outward that much more fiercely. He dragged her along some ways, and when she could bear to look at him again, he was still obviously quite pleased with himself. They walked in silence for a while, long enough for him to start staring into space. He looked contented, but a bit serious all the same. Faith had meant to ask him about himself, but now they'd slipped into quietly enjoying the night together. They were still roughly 15 minutes from the farm, and Faith's mind began to wander too. Together, they were both traveling along the road, completely checked out of reality. She didn't know that what her male escort, or perhaps she was the escort, she wasn't sure, was thinking. But she had the pigeons on the mind again. They are, admittedly, somewhat dirty birds. For one thing, it occurred to her exactly what was happening. Faith could certainly wander around at night, but it was simply unusual for a lady to walk a man home only to see herself across town by her lonesome. This man, whose name she really needed to ask, seemed polite enough. She'd be extremely disappointed if he said goodbye at his own doorstep. That meant he'd either go well out of his way to walk her all the way back to her own home, or he planned to have her stay the evening. The first possibility seemed like a lot of hassle, and it did seem awfully convenient that he'd forgotten how to get to the orchard. She became a little frightened at the prospect of the second possibility. For one, she hardly knew this man. No, she didn't know this man. For another, she wasn't even remotely prepared for this sort of thing. It crossed Faith's mind that she'd have no idea what to do. She had no real experience with the opposite gender, and this loomed over her further with each step closer to the farm. She also hadn't color-coordinated her underwear. She wasn't sure it was reasonable concern because it certainly wouldn't matter anyway, but she worried if he saw she'd come to a party wearing mismatched undergarments, then he'd just know for sure that men didn't think to take her home very often. He was also dressed rather nice, a bit of cologne or something to add some spice, a nice watch, and well-groomed too. Faith was just wearing a sweater and a skirt, not out to impress. And then there was the underwear thing again too. They were a bit on the worn and fuzzy side. It wasn't like people saw them very often. She hadn't thought it would matter. What if he thought she was pudgy? What if it turned out he was secretly her long-lost brother? She'd never seen him before. Who could say? When they finally reached the farm, Faith's heart was flapping to rival a hummingbird. She'd decided that if he'd offer to let her stay the night, she'd agree. But she'd go to see her friend AJ to ask for a spare bedroom. That way everything would be nice and nobody would get offended, and nobody would ever know her bra was the wrong color, especially not someone who was accidentally her brother. "Well, here we are," the man surmised. Faith waited. This was it. Whatever he did next, she had a swiftly raveled plan for it. She looked at him, and he looked at her. He glanced about in the darkness. "I think we've made a grave error," he said. "Do you mind if I walk you home?" At this point, Faith had to be honest with herself. She'd planned for everything that required her to shield the reality of her underwear from the world, including answering riddles from a sphinx under pain of death. She'd considered this alternate non-underwear possibility, but hadn't actually come up with a plan of action. She could still offer to get AJ's help, but now she felt like she'd be imposing. "Well, that's okay. You don't have to," Faith improvised. "I insist," the man replied cordially. "No, really. I know my way around town," Faith replied softly, beginning to feel a little silly about the Greek tragedy fears. It's a safe area." "It's not a problem at all," the man persisted. He took Faith by the hand and tugged at it gently, gesturing away from the farm as he searched her face. Okay," Faith faltered, smooth criminal that she was. They turned the other way and headed back towards Faith's home, which was clear on the other side of town. Faith was feeling a little fuzzy inside. She was holding his arm again, but he'd taken her by the hand just a moment ago. It was like walking around with a knight. Well, not a knight, but at least a nice guy who was very polite and treated Faith like a pretty lady. "You look rather young to be a vet," the man observed. "Isn't that a medical program?" Yes," Faith replied, answering both questions at once and punctuating the answer with a little distress. She averted her eyes to the dirt road. She didn't like to talk about her schooling. It had been a lot of stress, and plenty of people around town didn't have degrees. Her friend AJ was very smart, but the orchard was the family business. It made Faith feel guilty. "I used to have a lot of interest in the sciences," the man said, changing the subject. "It doesn't do me a whole lot of good these days, though." "Oh? What did you study?" Faith asked. "Oh, a little of everything," he replied. "I was pretty aimless in college." That was too bad, Faith thought. Maybe he hadn't done so well. They walked together in silence for a while. The light was dim, and Faith had to gently tug her companion whenever they needed to turn. Faith blamed herself for dropping the ball on her end of the conversation. She'd left her new friend in a bit of a rut as far as topics were concerned. "I skipped a grade in high school," she confided, trying to seem more friendly. "And I also took some advanced placement courses, just to get ahead. Most people don't think to." "You must be pretty smart," her companion suggested. "No," Faith plied shyly, certain that if he'd been bad at school, then she'd hurt him somehow. "Mine was a shorter degree than human medicine anyway." "No, really?" he insisted, trying to meet Faith's eyes. "I wish I had that kind of foresight. You should take pride in that kind of natural gift." Faith hummed in obedient agreement, but went on staring objectively at the ground. His face didn't leave hers. "Thank you," she offered, hating the compliment. More silence ensued. It was still a ways to Faith's house. The quiet was worse than the dark, and it seemed as though the man was patiently waiting for Faith to take the next line. "I didn't make a lot of friends in school," Faith said, trying to explain herself. She didn't want him to think there was something wrong with him. Faith couldn't make out the man's face in the poor light, but it looked like he was giving her some kind of look. "Really? You?" he asked, incredulous. "You didn't even make any harmless guy friends?" Faith smiled, despite herself. "I made a few," she admitted, fondly remembering the occasional hopeless romantic hopeful. She could see the glint of her friend's teeth as he grinned. "You know, I once had a friend who chased a girl like you for 5 years, he told her. "Poor guy could never figure her out." Now she waited for him to tell her a story. He looked away. "She was quiet, like you," he said. "Pretty," he added distantly, like dredging a painful memory. "But we were all kids then." "Maybe she thought he was really handsome too," Faith suggested. She wasn't sure exactly what she meant by that, but maybe it was a safe way of stating a kindness. "Well, I'm sure that would have made him happy," the man responded warmly, nodding towards her. That made Faith smile again. She liked this. It was like passing secret messages. They went on like this for the rest of the trip. Their conversation was slow in some spaces, but where it occurred, it included those little nuances and nods towards some special meaning. Faith wondered if it was typical for a date. Maybe she'd be missing out. They finally arrived at a modest 2-story cottage. Most of the money had gone into the land around it, which Faith had bought so her dogs and other pets could run around. In fact, the countryside had been the whole point of moving out to this small town. That and to avoid the bustle of the city. The two drifted to a stop at Faith's door. Her male companion released her arm. "This is my home," Faith supplied. "I live here," she added, in case there was confusion. It was late. Faith had work the next day, and she was tired. Still, she didn't want her new friend to go. She still hadn't asked his name, but by now it was long past the point of embarrassment to ask for it. He'd probably forgotten he hadn't introduced himself. She wanted to bring him inside and prolong things until she could figure it out. Maybe he'd say his own name in a short anecdote or something. She thought again about how her underwear were mismatched. He probably wouldn't mind, though. He seemed pretty accepting of her so far. Not that it mattered. Not that it was going to matter, because Faith wasn't going to ask him inside for anything like that. And if she did ask him inside, it was just so they could talk for a little while longer. "Well," he said. Faith wanted to take him by the hands and lead him into her living room. She was already up way too late. He could stay for another few minutes. She wasn't sure what she wanted to talk about at this point. She just really wanted him to stay. Tiny little pigeons cooed softly in the hindquarters of her mind. "Well, thank you for a wonderful evening, Faith," the man told her, taking her hand into his. "It was a pleasure meeting you." Faith nodded. She tried to bring her mouth to form words, but was torn between goodbye and her other options. The man released her, then turned to the road. She watched him go before fishing for her key in her pocket. She unlocked the door and let herself inside, met by cool air. The house had gotten a little nippy at night by itself.